Hey everybody, this is Joel. I'm hanging out down at Boom Comics in Topeka, Kansas. And today I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of a maybe a bit dry sort of technical description of how you stay oriented in the Dryden Universe. This is especially during the primer and the Age of Beauty. How do you find stars? How do you know where stars are? How do you know how close two objects are to each other? So this is maybe not going to be really exciting, but it's going to be one for the sort of hardcore folks who are working maybe in the role-playing game or computer design or storytellers who are concerned about where their story happens in relation to some of the other objects. It's maybe going to be a little bit interesting because as I do the description, I'm also going to talk about some of the things that we already know are in space and where they are relative to our system. And there's just a couple of things that we need to keep in mind in order to be effective with our system. And really, to me, the most important one is please, please, please don't ever give anything a name that comes from the actual world around us, outside of the Sol system, of course. And the reason for that is entirely practical. I don't know which stars ended up being which stars in our science fiction version of the universe, and I never want to have to figure it out. That just seems like a real nightmare to try to match up an actual star map to our fictional star map. So with the exception of maybe one or two stars that we know are very close to Earth, Proxima Centauri for example, I really want to stay away from things with identifiable names. Please give it whatever creative, lovely name you'd like. Just try to stay away from the names of things in the actual galaxy around us. Alright, so having said that, how do you get oriented in Dryden space? And I'm going to talk about things assuming that we're at the year 2503, which is present date for the primer, and generally speaking. And the way that you keep track of things in the Dryden Universe is with a simple XY coordinate system. If you look on the Dryden Author and Artists page on Facebook, there's a list of all known planets and star systems that have been identified in different folks' stories. And the numbering system is 3 digits. It's the X coordinate, it's the Y coordinate, and it's the distance. And you can map yourself out on a sphere just with those 3 coordinates. So the orientation for the system is that you are standing on Sol, our sun, and you are looking at galactic center. So galactic center is X0, Y0, and then the distance is what, 6,000 miles to galactic center? I don't actually know. 6,000 light years rather to galactic center. Somebody called me on that. And then, so if we wanted to go just slightly off to the right of that, we would go to a positive X. So we go X. So we go to 1, 0, 6,000 if we want to say 6,000 light years out. And then if we wanted to come back this way, it'd be -1, 0. And then of course if we went up, it'd be 0, 1, and 0, -1, and then whatever your distance is. So all the way around behind us, our x's meet at positive and -180, and going up and down they meet at positive and -180 also. So if I wanted to head over here, I'm going about to 90, 0, and if I wanted to go straight up, I would go to 0, 90. So we're drawing a full sphere around Sol, assuming that our point of reference is galactic center. So what does the Dryden Universe look like around that? And please, somebody who's good at graphic design and good at mapping, do something beautiful, and I'll promote it for you and then put it up on the website, and we'll draw attention to your fabulous skills. But in the year 2503, the galaxy, or the human explored space, has roughly a tube that follows the arm of the Milky Way that's around us, that's about 300 light years in length and about 100 light years around, and that's a very vague number. The assumption is that the fastest ships travel at about a light year per day, and I wanted it to be a year's journey to make it from one end of human space to the other. Sounds good to me. All right, inside of that tube you've got planets, some of which have been colonized for 150, 200 years. They're well established, they have organized governments, they have big corporations that run them. And then outside of that, there's a halo. There have been starships headed off into space for a long time now, and we don't know where they all are, and we don't know how many of them have survived. The farthest out object that we know is in the 2300s during the story Alder's World. The ship, the Duster, reached a distance of about 1,000 light years from Sol, and it headed off in the negative X direction, somewhere around negative 90, 1,000 years out into space. And that's the farthest identified that we've had stories told about. And certainly any other humans that show up that far from Sol, in the primer at least, are the way out there kind of guys, your bold explorers on the edge of space. So that's what it looks like. We've got the sort of central core of planets called the main run, and then outside of that we have this nebulous area that's not really very well defined. It's waiting for you to do some exploring in it. The political organizations, there are 3 major corporations that own a whole lot of populated space in 2503, and they are oriented roughly, if you take a slice out from Earth and it goes out to the east and west and a little bit to the north and south, that is mostly controlled by TerraCore. If you read the history on the Dryden Author and Artist page, you'll find that in the course of humans' exploration of space, there were several different governments inside of the solar system, and eventually they all got sort of either co-opted or driven out of the system by TerraCore. TerraCore is now a big, ancient, well-established corporation that owns several hundred star systems. It uses the Geist Marines. It's famous for its heavy marines that it uses to solve problems for it. And it's right close to Earth, and then sort of forms a disk going out from Earth this way. Headed towards Galactic Center from there is the youngest of the major corporations. Its name is Circ, S-Y-R-C-H. Circ is designed to be absolutely the low-brow, scummy, cheap rip-off corporation that we all love to hate. It hires assassins to solve its problems. It's really only concerned with profits. It grows very, very fast. The very biggest ships in the universe are built by it at the lowest possible quality. They are working on a ring system off towards Galactic Center at a distance of, I want to say, about 300 light years from Earth, sort of at the far edge. They're big, they're despicable, they do all the worst environmental things that you could ever want. They're having some trouble by the time they get to 2503 because Il Soltaire, which is the human Cetacean hybrid species that took off into space, also took off towards Galactic Center and has announced a lot of the space out there beyond about 300 light years towards Galactic Center off limits to humans, and ships that enter systems that Il Soltaire have declared off limits just vanished. They're never heard from again. Those are Charlotte Garnier's flying space whales. They're really wonderful, and they own a chunk of space that we don't actually know how big it is, but it's off towards Galactic Center. So then coming back towards TerraCore and heading back this way, the very oldest corporation, in a lot of ways the most genteel and respectable, is Lincor. And Lincor actually traces its history to the very first permanent base that was put on the moon. It was put there by the Chinese government, and they have had a long and varied history since then. They did eventually leave the Sol system, and they moved out away from Galactic Center, back off into the narrower, more sparsely populated parts of the galaxy this way. They're big, they have long traditions and history. They are the most receptive to things like environmental protections and good work conditions for their workers and so on and so forth. And I think in my mind they're probably also the biggest in terms of number of planets. There are a couple of other interesting items out there that we know where they are. If you head back out towards the parts of space that's controlled by Lincor, you find the Fleet Prime, which is the home of the League of Planets, and the League of Planets is not a real powerful entity when it comes right down to it. These are guys who are very interested in environmental protection. They're very interested in scientific research. National Geographic would definitely be very closely aligned with them, as well as the Audubon Society if we were in the 20th century. And they are a sort of social political entity that strives to protect independent planets from corporate takeover. They seek to protect rare species and planets with fragile ecosystems from exploitation, and they're heavily involved in scientific exploration of space. They hosted the Solo class of spaceships, which were not really multi-generational spaceships, but spaceships intended to survive in space for 10 and 20 years on their own, exploring deep beyond human space. They were sponsored by League Prime. In a lot of ways, the League is intended to be sort of like the UN is today. It's a great idea, and they do a lot of speech giving, but in the end, they don't have a whole lot of power. They are closely aligned with a lot of sort of smaller independent systems that are not so able to survive against the corporations on their own. So they're important, and they're a part of the political environment, but they're not the biggest thing that's out there. The other thing that has happened is if we go out towards the positive X out here on this side of human space, there's been encounters with an alien species that have resulted in armed confrontation. These appeared in Songs of Distant Stars by Daniel Hunt. We don't know a lot about them. We don't know how big that species is. We know that they are not significantly advanced beyond humans in terms of technologies. Dan Hunt wrote them, and they have been illustrated by Joel Stottlemire. I don't think the image is on the Facebook page, but I'll get it out there. Very similar to humans, but an alien, sort of a classic, we've met aliens in space, and now we must have battle kind of a species. We also know from the experience in the story Alder's World, that there is a planet that is being terraformed by a species called the Technoprey, who don't actually appear significantly in our universe for another 35,000 years, but they've been encountered off on the other direction at the negative 90 or 45 degrees by the duster in the story Alder's World. There's a planet called Sufin. I'd have to find the exact address for it there on the Facebook page, but it's located about 50 years away from Earth, and it's kind of off back this way. It is a fiercely independent planet. It is a democratic planet. It is not under any corporate or government control. And they tend to be agitators. They are political activists, and they're sort of an interesting stock of folks because they came from a relatively high G planet, and they're short and stocky, very muscular. They have appeared a couple of times now in a couple of different places, and they're always the guerrilla warrior, radical, independent role. And I think that's maybe enough to start getting folks oriented. Absolutely, you should go out and look at the known star systems listed out there on the Facebook page. That will help you understand the sphere that goes out. And then, of course, this is talking about the primer. Once we get into the Age of Beauty, the Second Age, and into the Dark, and so on and so forth, we stop knowing so much where these planets go and what their histories are, or maybe we see their history, the end of these star systems happen. And then when we come back in Codex 2, of course, the galaxy is remapped, and we don't know what it looks like, and that is wide open. All right. Well, I'm Joel. This is Boom Comics. Thanks for joining us.